Now with us for more is Derek Crow at Brave New Foundation. He's a political director there. Derek, thank you so much for being with us. I wish we were talking about a more optimistic issue, but unfortunately we're not. What message do you have as this country returns back from its three-day weekend, honoring the dead?
Well, I mean, the problem with honoring the living is that once these people come home, they're all too often forgotten. There are new statistics out just this week showing that the unemployment rate for returning veterans is a 2 percentage point increase over the unemployment rate for non-veterans, and it's even worse among those who are 18 to 24. They have a 1 in 5 unemployment rate, and that's because the jobs that they work when they're not in the military and the skills that they pick up in the military they're not marketable when they get home, and those job sectors have been severely impacted by the recession. So this points out not only the economic incentives that are being used to lure people into the military, but also how those economic incentives are false.
And that's just one slight, tiny fraction of the bigger picture. I mean, when we talk about cutting defense spending, one of the biggest things you hear is, well, you know, the healthcare costs are out of whack. We need to spend less money on PTSD programs because we just don't have all of the money to support these veterans when they get home. And I just find it ironic that when we talk about war, I mean, we usually talk in millions and billions. We're set to spend $113 billion on Afghanistan this fiscal year. The White House wants, I think, $107 billion for the next. And yet, when it comes to spending on those who've returned home from the conflict, the funds aren't there. Why the disparity?
Well, it's because on a balance sheet, when you're trying to sell a war to Congress or to the American people, you can't show those indirect costs, or the costs will be astronomical, and that's the honest cost. I mean, Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes have shown that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were going to cost originally $3 trillion, and they've since revised those estimates up when you account for things like caring for wounded soldiers. And if you remember, when Donald Rumsfeld and his cronies were selling the Iraq war, they were estimating only a few $1 billion worth of costs here. But the reality is, when these troops come home, as Jake Diliberto said in your setup there, many of them have PTSD that have to be dealt with. Many of them have life-altering injuries, and their families sometimes lose work because they have to stay home and take care of them. So when they recruit you for the military, you should have this information in mind, that your skills are probably not going to be marketable, and that you're probably not going to get that money for college. And when you come home, your injuries are going to not only affect your economic life, but those of your family.
And the irony there is that the amount that we spend on a deployed service person in Afghanistan, and this is according to the Obama administration itself, it amounts to $1 million per year on each service person in Afghanistan because of rising fuel costs, et cetera, and yet we don't have that money to spend on folks who come back. It's really quite an outrage. Do you, now that we're actually talking a little bit more in Congress about the impending drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, do you have any sense that there's a discussion about what to do with the veterans who will be coming home?
Well, I think what's really encouraging is that this week there's a story out in the Washington Post that's shown that the cost of war generally has become one of the top topics when we're talking about how fast to bring these troops home. And so I think that's a very encouraging sign, because it has shifted away from the sort of scaremongering that got us into this mess into the more practical terms of, can we afford this war? And the cost of caring for these veterans has got to be a part of it. I mean, just compare, we spend $11,000 or more recruiting each person for the military, but less than $1,000 in the United States on educating each person, or excuse me, just slightly over $1,000. And that tells you that our priorities are out of whack, and we can't afford to keep sending people to this war that's not making us safer and that's not worth the cost. And I think there is real hope that once these after effects of war are taken into account, that Congress is going to be a little more responsible about how easily they allow the executive to take us into war.
You may have been encouraged by the Washington Post article, but I was pretty discouraged by the Wall Street Journal article. I don't know if you saw that. The Pentagon is now saying that in retaliation to a cyber attack, yeah, we may use real force and troops on the ground in some instances. So I don't know if I'd be so optimistic about the end of a conflict here.
That's terrifying. It's an absolute crazy idea. But yeah, I'm also discouraged by that as well.
I mean, who are they going to invade? A bunch of hackers at a coffee shop somewhere? But I guess to close off this interview, what will it take? How many deaths? What kind of toll will it take for the country to actually change its actions in the way that it treats its veterans?
I think we're there, actually, at least as far as whether or not we're going to send people to war or allow these wars to continue. Most people oppose these wars, and if you ask people how much we should spend to take care of veterans, they'll tell you whatever it takes. So the real question is, are we going to allow ourselves to be taken into these situations where we generate wounded veterans and broken families in the future? And judging by the way public sentiment is turning away from the Afghanistan war and the way it's always been against the Iraq war, I think we've got a real chance here to solidify a foreign policy sentiment in this country that says war should not be the first option. It shouldn't be anything but the very last option, if any option. And when we do send people to combat, we have an obligation to take care of them when we come home, but to also be honest about how much that's going to cost.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for helping us remember to honor not just those who have perished in the wars, but the living as well. That was Derek Crow, Political Director at the Brave New Foundation.